Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and you're listening to the latest episode of the TND podcast. Glory to the Lord, glory to the podcast Lord. Yes, we are still going strong. And in this special interview episode, we are going to be doing just a couple conversations, lengthy conversations, on the musical art form, the musical subgenre known as Vaporwave. Once sort of a bit of a gawked at, misunderstood internet-based microgenre, but maybe sort of unbeknownst to the music world, the style of music, the scene, the Vaporwave culture, rather, has kind of grown into a pretty diverse array of artists and music fans who are listening to these artists who are very passionate about them, buying records, following the releases of labels like Dream Catalog, which are releasing Vaporwave records, numerous Vaporwave records, a year. Now, we have an interview with Mr. Wolfenstein OSX, a bit of a amateur Vaporwave musician and documentarian who had a very interesting YouTube video sort of documenting Vaporwave's artistic trajectory up until about this year. And then we also have David from the Dream Catalog label, the founder and owner of the label. And so we're going to just get into these two conversations. One will play right after the other. And before we kick that off, I do want to say that the TND podcast is a listener-supported podcast. We continue this podcast because we are being supported by you monetarily to keep this podcast going. And if you would like to support this podcast yourself, get it delivered to you via, a nice MP3 delivery, have access to a monthly bonus show. There will be other perks going into the future as well. Then please donate to this podcast, support this podcast over at patreon.com/TND podcast. The link is in the description. And with no further ado, here are the Vaporwave interviews. Okay, hey, thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, sure.
Your documentary really sparked an interest for me to want to, sort of ask some questions directly to people who, are sort of involved with the genre or passionate about the genre. Mm-hmm. In a day or so, I have an interview with somebody over at a Dream Catalog, so we're going to pull that together, this interview and that interview together into, sort of a full podcast episode.
Okay.
All right, so, you would like me to refer to you in this interview as Wolfenstein OSX, I'm guessing?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, or just Wolfenstein, Wolf for short?
Yeah, why not?
Okay. So I checked out your Vaporwave documentary, and I don't know, I guess I just really liked it, and in a way it just kind of it was just refreshing to see somebody kind of really passionate about the genre, because at least from what I've seen online, it seems like there's a real mix of different opinions on the style, and maybe even an overabundance of people who you even sort of note in your documentary as maybe not taking the genre that seriously.
Yeah. It's kind of, it's one of those things where, because the internet's just so vast and there's just so many, people that are into this genre, it tends to be mostly at this day and age, the people who are mostly getting into it are just like these young kids. And I think the reason why no one has really took it that seriously is just because, most of the releases that are coming out there are made, just by these, pretty much just untalented producers that downloaded, these cheap audio editing softwares and just looping these old 80s funk tunes. And, so it's, I guess it kind of turns people off from it a lot when they sort of see that. But if you really dig deep, you will find people who are, a lot of talented musicians who are, take this genre seriously and really want to sort of develop it and make it sort of become bigger than what it initially set out to be.
Well, it seems like in a way, I mean, at least from what I can see at the start, talking about Daniel Lopatin, sort of saying that, Echo Jams was a bit of a sort of hokey experiment that I was trying.
Yeah.
As well as the name Vaporwave, which when you talk about it, you sort of are pulling these kind of political interpretations and these social interpretations from it.
Yeah.
But in a way, I kind of see, and I don't know if you can shed light on this, but I don't know if the artists themselves, coined this term to call themselves, but, sort of making such a genre name seems like kind of self-effacing or self-deprecating. To me, the name isn't so much political as much as it is like a nod to chillwave, and not that it's like, directly influenced by it stylistically, but it seems like a nod to the fact that, we have all of these kind of micro internet based musical genres right now, and that they're so, I guess, short lived, and they have such a short shelf life. Although ironically, Vaporwave has outlasted a lot of the recent sort of internet micro genres.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't really see the political ideologies either. The only reason I put them in the documentary was because there was so much talk about that, and I felt like, and I've heard other interpretations of the name, and I sort of saw the whole, Marxist ideology spawn from that, and I kind of just put that in there because I thought that would be a good tie-in to... Because for a while, a lot of these releases were like sort of critiques on capitalism, but I kind of only put the political ideologies in there just because I felt that it would be best to sort of give a holistic view of the history of how this genre was sort of synthesized from that aspect. But yeah, I mean, it might have come from chillwave. It might have come from any other sort of genres of music. But ultimately, I thought that would be sort of the best way to sort of give people who are watching it sort of what, I guess, all the hype about it was about.
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think that the genre is apolitical. I mean, if you sort of sidestep and ignore a lot of what, music writers have kind of tagged onto the genre itself, kind of in an effort to build a narrative around it, because I mean, a lot of music writers, they love a narrative.
Yeah.
But but still, I mean, without sort of trying to craft one around Marxism, there's still like a lot going on in the genre. Maybe not, as far as like a statement, maybe it's not, maybe it wasn't as clear as when it first kind of set out. But I think, you can look at a lot of the early Vaporwave stuff now and kind of see that there's definitely a statement going on there in terms of like the disposability and just kind of how fleeting a lot of modern internet music is.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's kind of what I tried to talk about more later in the documentary. And I just kind of wanted to touch on the capitalism thing because, like I said, it was kind of like a big thing and everyone kind of thought that's what it was all about. And I put that in there and tried to make like the audience realize, well, that's not what it's about. And there's a lot more going on to it than just, I guess like an ironic look at capitalism by using these old elevator music tunes or something,
Sure. Yeah. And I definitely think that there's, in a sense, I do think there is something punk about this style of music, and not that I think this style of music aligns itself with the politics of punk, and I mean, a lot of people say that new music things are punk. I mean, truly at the end of the day, punk is only going to be the only thing that was ever punk. But Vaporwave to me seems similar in the way that it kind of seems like, how to say this without insulting anybody, but it kind of seems like this thing that anybody can try. Yeah. And it kind of seems open source kind of in that way. Like it kind of seems like this strange abstract style of like community music on the internet.
And honestly, that's sort of what attracted it to me in the first place, because like when I started making it myself, I was kind of just like, I just did it in an afternoon just for fun. And that kind of got me into production just in terms of music. And I eventually started developing my craft and getting better and better, writing my own music and learning about all kinds of using all kinds of editing software. And it just started off using like these really basic audio editing softwares like Audacity and whatnot. And I think it's sort of a great genre for these young producers that are trying to get into music and they have really no experience whatsoever, and it sort of teaches you to sort of practice that, I guess. But
yeah,
at least that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, and it kind of seems like there's not really any sort of, I guess, emotional or, though we just mentioned the politics, it kind of seems like there aren't really any sort of emotional or, I guess, political presumptions that you necessarily need to go into the genre with in order to make it. Like, you don't need to be at a certain talent level, or you don't need to be like in a certain kind of mindset, or you don't need to be making a certain kind of statement. It's something that you can kind of just, I guess, take a casual approach to and have fun with without having to worry about whether or not the end product is like the greatest thing that mankind's ever created.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, it is easy to make, and it's very accessible, and I think like a lot of people kind of look down on that aspect of it, but I see it as very positive, and it makes music more, or just like the community of musicians much more open and much more inclusive, rather than it being just a couple of people who are really good at one thing and they just kind of want to keep it the same, I guess. And I mean, yeah, it's
I guess that is that statement and that sentiment right there, I guess, is part of why if there is sort of one thing that is important to the recipe, it seems like anonymity is pretty pivotal. That statement you made, I think is why anonymity is pretty important, because there's not supposed to be this hierarchy of popularity.
And it's sort of this idea of being anonymous and sort of posting music without knowing who originally made it or what it's all about. It makes it more about the music itself and less about the person making it. And I think in that aspect, it sort of makes it just, it's hard to explain. It just sort of creates this sort of like ambiance to the music, I guess, and it makes it much more mysterious, and kind of you're thinking about who made this music or where it came from. And I mentioned that in the documentary, where like it sort of just came from another dimension and you have no idea who made it, and it's just like these weird ambient kind of sounds, and you're I mean, it's pretty psychedelic if you look into it like that, but
it can be. I mean, it's I mean, even though there isn't a face, literally a face behind a lot of these records, because the people prefer to sort of stay anonymous, there's definitely a face as far as the visual aesthetic style that a lot of people are throwing onto these album covers, and sort of like what you were talking about, from another dimension, that's what it seems like the music is coming from. That's where it kind of seems like a lot of the music is coming from visually as well. I mean, I'm pushing 30 soon.
Yeah.
And it feels like, to me, I grew up with a lot of the imagery that ends up on these covers, as far as like, the video game styles and, sort of the pop stars that are being sampled, as well as, some of the older kind of sci-fi or action flicks, whose visuals, some of which come from overseas, and kind of like the Windows 98 and 95 shit that's sort of thrown into the mix of a lot of these visuals. And it seems like nostalgia, but nostalgia for a time that never like really existed. Yeah. Because like these visuals never quite looked this way. They kind of have this like weird warped I guess representation sort of in the context of vaporwave art and visual aesthetics anyway.
And I think that's kind of an aspect, like this sort of warped nostalgia, which is I think what makes this genre kind of very I guess different, is because it's dealing with, like, at least the way I see it, sort of a way like how memory works and how we remember things from our past, but they're never exactly the same and they're always kind of distorted. And I think even just now you look on the internet and everyone's super nostalgic about the 80s and 90s, and that's pretty much all you see. And most of the people who are nostalgic about that are like, there's like a typical thing that goes around where it's like people born in 1999 like call themselves 90s kids, even though they don't have any recollection of that decade whatsoever, because they were, yeah. And I think that sort of aspect of memory is very important in a lot of vaporwave releases, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about the 80s or 90s, but just about distorting like this perception of reality and making it kind of I guess open-ended to the listener, to what they should feel, whether they should feel nostalgic or they should feel at unease or they should feel relaxed, because a lot of these releases borrow from new age samples, and that's supposed to be like a spa thing, it's supposed to be relaxing, but a lot of the times it's kind of very unnerving and very kind of at least for me, like I kind of feel like this sense of anxiety when listening to this, especially some from, like, let's say Infinity Frequencies, who I mentioned, who uses a lot of samples from new age artists, and it's very off-putting and not exactly relaxing, I guess.
So you're talking about kind of this weird, warped, sort of nostalgic visual approach on some of these records, and and also sort of from the music that's being sampled as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, is it more about the act of manipulating and warping than it is about the act of referencing? I mean, is anybody who is pulling from this stuff truly nostalgic about anything that they're pulling from, or is it just kind of the set in place standard as far as like vaporwave visuals and aesthetics go? Because it seems like, at least from an outside observer, that vaporwave has more of a decided, and it's funny given that the genre is anonymous. A lot of the artists are anonymous, but maybe this is why. It seems like vaporwave has a more set visual aesthetic than it does a musical aesthetic sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's just because of how people just sort of like to listen to the genre, and they look at vaporwave and they want to look at an album cover that sort of makes them feel like, okay, this is a vaporwave album.
Sure.
But necessarily the music doesn't exactly have to all be the same, because it's really about the music, not so much about the album artwork, although I do think the artwork is important for just sort of putting an image into like the listener's mind of what, is like the music is trying to sort of encapsulate, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, now that we've really kind of dove into the whole visual aesthetic as well as the politics thing, because I just mentioned it, the sonic aesthetic of vaporwave, mm-hmm. And maybe there are people who are more, I don't know, you can tell me, I mean, maybe there are people who are more purists who are vaporwave fans, but it kind of seemed like, you definitely took an angle in your short little documentary there, that what's best for vaporwave is that we have more producers coming in and kind of fusing it with other sounds and other genres.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most important thing for the creation of pretty much any genre. Mm-hmm. I was like having an online conversation with someone. I don't know, it was like a YouTube thing, but I mentioned, like, if you look at rock music, for example, and you look at Muddy Waters, who isn't like known as a rock musician, he's known as a blues musician. And then you look at someone like Elvis, who is known as, you know, the king of rock and roll, but both their styles are very similar, but you still sort of categorize Muddy Waters and the blues. And then you look at something like Sonic Youth or My Bloody Valentine, and they're still part of the same genre as Elvis, but like Muddy Waters sounds more like Elvis than Elvis sounds more like them. And I think the same thing is happening to Vaporwave now, where we sort of, it's because it's such a new genre that there are no real set rules as to what it can be. And I think that the best thing for it right now is to just have as many people try to change it up and try to, you know, push it into whatever direction they choose, and then just let let time run its course and see where Vaporwave goes, and not trying to pin it down with specific rules, because you know, that kind of limits you know, I guess the musical growth of it.
I mean, I can most definitely see that, you know, as, I mean, what you just said there is inarguable. However, though, you know, you subtract out the you know, get rid of the names and the titles, get rid of the album art. Mm-hmm. If I hand you a record that I tell you is Vaporwave, you know, what's the first thing you're expecting to hear when you put that record on? Or, you know, if you sort of happen upon a completely artless, titleless record that is Vaporwave, what are those initial things that you're catching in your ears and you're like, okay, you know, that's what's telling me in my head that this is this genre? Because, you know, from the artists that you were pulling from, or, you know, kind of referencing in your documentary, you know, there are artists who create Vaporwave with completely just, you know, live organic instrumentation, no samples at all.
Yeah.
There are other artists that are sort of making Vaporwave, you know, that are sort of bringing a, you know, trap style percussion into the mix. There are artists like Saint Pepsi, who I'm familiar with, that you've talked about, who, you know, aren't technically Vaporwave, but are offshoots of it and are making much poppier, funkier versions of it, like kind of fusing it with, like, you know, French house and, you know, just like some really great house music and stuff like that. And there are artists like, I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but it came out on Dream Catalog, I believe, and I think it was the final album that you referenced in the documentary.
Oh, yeah, 2814.
Yeah. I gave that album 2 listens over, and, you know, while I didn't mind it, you know, it just really kind of read to me more like an ambient record than it did something I would have associated with, like, you know, a lot of those early records that had come out around the time of Floral Shop Plus. Mm-hmm. You know, so what is sort of the common thread to you that kind of pulls all of these records together, you know, into this umbrella term? And, you know, we could say ahead of time that just because, you know, you may have a certain opinion or perception doesn't mean you as an artist need to make a Vaporwave record with that in mind. I mean, you know, feel free to experiment, but you as a fan, you know, what is sort of that common thread that pulls all those records together into this genre?
I mean, honestly, I think that that's what makes Vaporwave so much different from other genres, is that it's sort of, it doesn't really rely heavily on, like, what its sonic qualities are, because it really is about putting everything together. It's all about the aesthetic presentation. What are the titles of the tracks? What is the theme of the album itself when you're putting it out there? And that's kind of why I put that whole little thing about the Floral Shop 2 at the end of the documentary, where he's saying it's like the post music, I guess. And a lot of people can disagree with that and sort of, I guess, shy away from that sort of idea. But I think that the point raises a question that is very important about how we listen to music now and how it's sort of changing, and that Vaporwave is really about creating this sense of ambience, or creating this sort of narrative that's sort of in its own world, I guess. It's hard to explain, but I'm kind of going on a tangent, but, like, Yeah, I mean, I can't really say that there is really like a definitive sonic quality that makes a vaporwave album a vaporwave album. And like you said, 2814 could be an ambient album as well if it was titled something else and it was just like a very plain kind of, just album. But the fact that it has this whole narrative tied behind it and it has this whole sort of central idea and sort of this whole, I guess, like ambience to it makes it kind of vaporwave, I guess. And we kind of see that in a lot of albums that come from before that where they're heavily conceptual, and we sort of like to see them, or we can easily see that those are vaporwave. Like I was actually talking about this with a friend of mine, and we were like talking about all these old albums, and we're trying to like figure out like if they were released today, would they be considered vaporwave just because of what they represent? And you look at something like even the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper is in a lot of ways very kind of vaporwave-esque. I wouldn't like say completely just because it is the Beatles and you kind of see a face of who's making this work, but the whole idea that they're this kind of weird Sgt. Pepper's band, they don't really exist in theory, and I guess that's kind of the idea of vaporwave, is that you don't really know if what like the musicians are playing it even exists, kind of, because it's pretty much all centered around electronic music, and it's hard to say what like the definitive rules of what makes a vaporwave artist, because like I said, it's such a new genre. It's only existed for like 4 years now,
but I mean, there's so many records, though. I mean, within that short amount of time, we've compiled so many albums. Many of which share similar aesthetics. Yeah,
and I mean, I guess those are the sort of guidelines, I guess.
It seems like the guidelines, for you, and I agree. I mean, it seems like the guidelines are more about the concept, the context, the visuals, and the anonymity than it is any kind of simple musical guideline, which isn't necessarily, which in a way, I mean, you could argue that it means that these people aren't truly appreciating the music, or that they're not emphasizing the music, because it seems like the music isn't taking priority, and that there isn't defining rules for the music. But I think that's actually not necessarily the case, because it kind of seems like there's a lack of defining rules there in order to sort of liberate the music, and just kind of make it so, again, to sort of go back to that open source thing, like it's kind of this. To me, I mean, if there is any sort of common threads pulling these albums together, it's that there's a generally ethereal feel, and whether you're using samples, using live instrumentation, whatever, it kind of has this sense of being older and just being found. Yeah, like you just kind of stumbled across it, sort of in a collection of cassette tapes at like the Goodwill or something. Yeah, like it just would have come from an older time, but from that time it would have been like throwaway music or something, or just it would have been background music from 20 or 30 years ago. Sort of making music with that kind of nostalgic disposability in mind, I guess I sort of wonder, is vaporwave a genre that going into the future, is it going to be a genre that can survive without its context? Is context sort of an integral part of the vaporwave formula as far as enjoying the genre? I mean, you talk about a band like the Beatles, and there are tons of people who, listen to the Beatles every day who don't necessarily, know the full context of the Beatles and know the whole story and didn't grow up during Beatlemania, but they could sort of listen to the Beatles outside of that context and find it as enjoyable music. 10 years down the road, if somebody stumbles across any of these vaporwave albums without knowing, their backstory or their concept or what exactly they're trying to represent or, conceptualize, will they still be enjoyable, sort of pulled out of those backstories and those concepts?
I think so. I think for a lot of, I guess, what you would say the not very well thought out releases will probably not be well understood by listeners in the future, but I think that a lot of releases that are coming out now that are sort of very well thought out, and they have a very strong narrative and a strong idea of what they're trying to represent. And I think that any listener in the future will be able to easily pick that up and see, what they're trying to create. But at the same time, all music genres sort of fade from popularity, but there's always going to be an audience who listens to it. And, you look at kids, there's always a new generation of kids who sort of reject sort of the previous genres of music that came before it, just because they didn't grow up during that time and they don't really understand what that music was about for them. They're used to what is current for them. I think that unless, if I talk to a 13-year-old kid, just an average 13-year-old, and try to have a conversation with him about, someone like Charlie Parker or Miles Davis or something like that, I don't think he would understand it fully unless he did some research beforehand and he listened to multiple records and sort of understood the whole, idea behind that genre of music. And I think it's the same for Vaporwave now. And, probably 40 years from now, there's probably going to be a new generation of, kids who are going to listen to this and they're not going to get it. But if there's, some people who are really into music and they're really like to delve into older styles of music, they'll be able to easily get into it, I feel.
All right. Sort of talking about Vaporwave's popularity, we'll sort of make this the last question.
Okay.
Sort of what do you see in the immediate future as Vaporwave's visibility? Because, while it seems like there's a lot of diversity going on in the genre right now, mm-hmm. Some artists embracing, organic instrumentation, some more poppy themes, others sort of trap sounds, and I'm going to assume that sort of diversity is going to continue, mm-hmm. Into the immediate future. And also simultaneously, you have more established producers who are making these really blatant references to the genre, whether they be, Daniel Lopatin on his latest record, where he was making some at least faint references to mm-hmm. a similar nostalgic vibe. And, also Actress as well on his latest full-length LP that came out last year. There was a track on that record that was distinctly a Vaporwave track. Mm-hmm. If the genre has a bit of a second wind in the public eye, do you think it's going to be because of sort of a breakout underground producer who, really kind of turns people onto the genre and kind of everybody has that aha moment? Or do you kind of see a bit of an Elvis type situation coming through where you have somebody who is, kind of a larger producer or a more established person, or somebody who's endorsed by the music industry, sort of bringing this sound forward and kind of capitalizing on it?
I think I agree with the latter, probably. I think that there probably will be at some point a very well-known artist who will delve into this kind of whole Vaporwave kind of theme, I guess, for one of their works, and that'll sort of popularize it, but I don't think it'll be exactly the same as most underground. It'll probably be very conventional and very easy to sort of appreciate, but still have that same kind of aesthetic and narrative qualities that possess many Vaporwave releases. But and on the flip side, there will also there will be these underground producers making more and more Vaporwave, and it'll become more developed, and these producers will become much more talented and make sort of almost be like composers, I guess, is the way I see it, just because of how free electronic music has become in terms of production. And that's sort of the way I see it, is just kind of, artists will sort of be more prone to make bigger projects that are more narrative based rather than just, I guess, just music styles, because of how, yeah, I mean, that's just the way I see it. Just probably just some big musician will come out there and make something that's similar to Vaporwave, but not really the same kind of thing, but it'll popularize it to the point where Vaporwave will become much more relevant in culture, I guess.
So you don't think, Vaporwave's sort of time in the sun is necessarily over? I mean, it necessarily has the potential to kind of lie dormant for years in the way that something like dubstep did, and then all of a sudden, we have guys like Skrillex sort of coming through.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a reason why it should stop, because, quite honestly, I don't think that a lot of artists want to stop making, and I don't think they want to stop improving on it, because, I've talked to the owner of Dream Catalog, Hong Kong Express, and he's very passionate about it, and he's a very versatile musician, and I think that there's going to be a lot more people like him who are, and it's not like they're going to become less popular, because they're going to keep making more, and they're going to make careers out of this kind of thing. And already Dream Catalog is pretty much pretty successful in terms of, what most Vaporwave releases are. I mean, barely any Vaporwave artists make any money from this sort of thing, and Dream Catalog is sort of the only thing that's looks like it's having some kind of impact, and it's, growing very quick, like at a very rapid pace. I only started listening to it like last year, and at that point it was like this very small thing that not many people listen to, and just like when they released their 100th release, I think they had like the top one of the top purchased albums on Bandcamp for that day, which is, pretty big. So yeah, I think that it'll probably be like dubstep, where it'll probably be underground for a while, and then all of a sudden just kind of explode and sort of take off in a weird way. But we'll see what happens.
All right, thanks for that. That was Wolfenstein OS X, Vaporwave creator, fan, and documentarian on the Needle Drop podcast, interviewing about Vaporwave, just everything from its sound to its visual and sonic aesthetic to its future. Thanks for coming on, man. Okay, and now to sort of continue our conversation and our deep dive into the Vaporwave world, we have David on the line, who are you going to be talking with about Vaporwave even further than we were just with Wolfenstein OS X. And the reason we have David on is that he is from the label Dream Catalog, the founder and owner of the label, which I think, Dave, you could argue, or maybe it's not even arguable, it may in fact just be fact. I mean, it has to be the largest Vaporwave label out there on the internet, correct?
Yeah, I'd say at this point it's probably the largest Vaporwave label out there. There's quite a few popping up at the moment, though, which are sort of making strides. But in general, yeah, I think I'd say it's fair to say that it's the largest label in Vaporwave scene.
Okay, so let's have a conversation now about just sort of what it is like to sort of be at the forefront of such a culture and sort of be running a label that sort of has a lot of visibility in this scene, and also a little bit later in the conversation, just some of the musical and sonic qualities of Vaporwave generally, and just kind of what you're looking for or finding out there when you're being approached, or maybe just kind of searching for artists to invite onto this label to contribute work to it. But sort of in the process of running a label like this, how exactly do you come across artists, and who do you decide sort of makes the cut and who doesn't, I guess?
So it's quite a hard process, really, because like being the largest Vaporwave label at the moment, we do get quite a lot of demos in, like quite regularly, at least 10 to 12 a week at the moment, and that's with the demos actually being shut as well. But in general, in the past, I've usually been finding artists on SoundCloud, Bandcamp, Reddit, places like that, and then I'll just like give them a message and just ask them if they have any interest.
And do you find yourself every week doing a lot of searching for artists, or do you can you usually sort of kick back and just kind of wait for the demos to kick in, or do you often find that what's submitted is not as quality as maybe what you stumble upon?
Yeah, in the past it was more a case of me approaching artists back when I first started the label. But as of late, I've been relying more on artists that I've had on the label for like basically the past year now. So I'd say really it's just a case of like sitting back and waiting to see what happens. Really, I do still get the odd demo that is like too good to not turn down. That I have to take on really, even though like I've say the demos are shut and all, but in general I've basically got like a little crew of guys that I've been putting out releases for. I'd say like the past year, like we haven't really brought too many new ones out, too many new guys in the past year.
Mm-hmm. And once somebody sort of passes a demo your way, just sort of what is the, and you do see that it is too good to pass up on, what's sort of the process like after that, as far as like, what does the machinery of Dream Catalog do necessarily? I mean, is it just kind of simply doing a digital release? If the artist wants to do something physical like a CD or a tape or something like that, is it kind of on themselves to sort of pull that together?
Yeah, so in the past it was strictly digital, but about January this year we started doing CDs, and then a couple of months later we introduced cassettes to the label. And at the moment we're actually putting out every album on cassette, and we're still doing the odd CD every now and then as well. But I generally tend to reserve the cassette and CD releases for artists that have already been on the label in the past, and artists that I know that our following actually enjoy.
Yeah, and these artists, you're saying that recently you're not taking on a lot of newer acts, or you just haven't found a lot of newer acts that you're looking to take on. But from what I have seen, it seems like there's a pretty wide array of artists on the label already. I mean, are you sort of ever met with the difficulty of having to put out all of that material that they're sort of pumping out?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I even have to reject albums from artists that are already on the label quite often. And that can be quite a difficult process to like try and be as diplomatic as I can with those and sort of explain like why I don't want to release this specific album. So like including the demos that we already get, and on top of the albums I get sent in by artists already on the label, like it can be like quite difficult to manage like the amount of content that's coming into the label constantly.
Yeah, it's Vaporwave. I mean, I like the fact that your label and just sort of labels in general, especially if they're sort of boutique and they kind of hone in on a particular scene or genre, they can sort of in a way be documentarians and sort of create this place where in the future we can go back and sort of rely on this thing to sort of remind us of this thing that either had happened at one time or sort of this ongoing trend that we are seeing, sort of where it came from. And I feel like in a way you're kind of curating and kind of guiding the direction Vaporwave is going in by sort of being in this sort of in the scene, sort of in this high profile decision and deciding which records are going to sort of be promoted to the Vaporwave consuming public, and which ones you're going to have to pass on. And I imagine in a genre such as Vaporwave, where a lot of the artists tend to be very prolific, that it can be kind of hard to keep up with that pace.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And like you said, like you was mentioning about how I'm sort of curating the direction of Vaporwave at the moment, that is like certainly something I feel like I have been doing, especially in the past 8 to 9 months, I'd say, when Dream Catalog really rose up in popularity. And that's something that I've actually faced some criticism for from people, especially artists who might not be able to get onto Dream Catalogue because the music might not be good enough, for example, or the music might not just be fitting the vibe that I try to aim for with my label.
Oh, talking about sort of the vibe of a record, something I was talking about with Wolfenstein was, I guess, sort of the common sonic and musical threads that sort of run through these Vaporwave records.
Yeah.
One point of our conversation was that we went into just how diverse the genre is sort of becoming now. It's not really sort of like this chopped and screwed old 80s and sort of R&B tunes that we sort of that some music writers, including myself, sort of gawked at a little bit. But now, there are a lot of Vaporwave producers incorporating elements of pop music and, trap percussion, as well as ambient music and just new age stuff and just generally experimental music. Is there anything on your label, that you think musically and sonically just links all of these albums together? I mean, is there something that when you're listening, a certain sonic characteristic that once you hear it, you're like, that makes it a Vaporwave record, or that's the Vaporwave sound?
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, and I think why you might sort of see such a wide difference between all the releases is because I actually view Vaporwave more as a thematic concept than just a music genre, which is defined by certain sounds and styles. So I liken it more to cyberpunk, for example, where it has more of a specific theme or style and concept and visuals and things of that nature. But there can be a sort of sound that travels across all the different artists' albums. I'd say things such going back to what you said earlier about the earlier releases where it was sort of chopping and screwing smooth jazz music and such. You can find a lot of jazzy chords and things of that nature, even in the trap-based stuff. Such as there's an artist called Vaperror on the label. He uses a lot of jazz chords in his music, which he writes himself with his own synthesizers. So there is some kind of musical similarity, but it can be really wide-ranging sonically.
It seems like that there is something really, I guess, essential to the genre in terms of just a similarity or just an akinness to ambient music as well. It kind of seems like a lot of the music that the artists pull from in a sincere way and maybe in sort of a mocking way as well, because, Wolfenstein was sort of making points about sort of this music that was being sampled, this muzak rather, sort of being pulled from in a way to sort of make this conceptual dystopian statement about sort of the fleetingness of music, or just kind of how things sort of in the digital age are so disposable. It seems like ambient music that's sort of meant to sort of sit in the background in a sense, is a huge influence on the style. I mean, would you say necessarily that that's kind of like something that is an important part of the recipe of any Vaporwave record, that it kind of work in the background as just kind of wallpaper music in a sense?
It can be, because I would say because a lot of the Vaporwave albums that are out there, especially at the moment, sort of try to hit a specific concept rather than just putting out a specific type of sound. That the music does sort of bring an overall visual concept to life, and that in that sense it is sort of secondary to the things such as not secondary, but it sort of meets halfway with things such as the album art and even the artist names and track titles and things of that nature. So there is some kind of background ambient aspect to it in that regard. But there is still a lot of Vaporwave that is really in your face about what it is, such as the recent Death's Dynamic Shroud album, which that was one that sort of was more rooted in the earlier aspects of the genre with the chopped and screwed style, where it was sampling a lot of different types of music, such as K-pop, and I think even there's a Drake sample on there apparently. But yeah, so it really it does go. It does depend from album to album, like what the artist's overall vision and message is. But in general, I think there is a little bit of truth to what you were saying.
Being somebody who runs a label with this kind of music, which not only has really close ties to ambient music, but Plunderphonics as well. Yeah. Do you ever sort of, I guess, kind of, break a sweat over just all the rampant sampling that, in a sense, you're kind of de facto responsible for?
Yeah, I do worry about it occasionally, but I sort of look at the overall picture of what's going on with music right now, and I don't really see any like copyright cases coming into action, especially not with underground music. Like a lot of the like issues with copyright at the moment are more to do with things such as YouTube and SoundCloud and things of that nature. So I'm not too concerned, but it is on the back of my mind a bit, and because of this, I do actually look for artists who are using at least samples in a more inventive manner rather than just slowing it down. Like I do look for stuff that uses a lot of original sounds as well. Yeah. Rather than like in the past you could get away with doing a vaporwave album that was just basically slowed down music, which I'm sure like everyone who's at least seen the genre a couple of times, especially albums like Macintosh Plus, for example, I think they would automatically assume the genre is just full of slowed down samples like that. But it's like, again, it's another thing which goes album to album. It's always different, really.
Mm-hmm. Another kind of conversation point I was having in the previous interview, and something that you were talking about earlier, kind of the concepts that go into these records.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself more of a fan of Vaporwave sound, its concept, or, are you also sort of the opinion that the two are just kind of inseparable, that, you can't necessarily enjoy these concepts without the sounds, that you can't enjoy the sounds without the concepts, that kind of thing?
In a sense, they are inseparable, but I do think Vaporwave does have the potential to become something more than a music genre. Like, I actually think there's potential to take it into like video games, films, books, and things of that nature. Like if you look at cyberpunk, for example, that started with fiction, with writers like William Gibson, for example. But that's really expanded in the past few decades to include films, video games, music, and I think Vaporwave really does have that potential to grow on to something like that.
I think the thing about cyberpunk, though, is that it sort of has a look to it, and not, sort of like a visual aesthetic that you can sort of look at on a Vaporwave record. But when you think of cyberpunk, I mean, you sort of think of a punk with like these kind of weird cyber, like futuristic qualities in a sense. Whereas like, I don't know if like there's a certain glorified visual look to somebody who produces or even listens to Vaporwave music per se. Vaporwave
is like a pretty strange community.
Vaporwave seems to be pretty entrenched into a lot of different artistic mediums. I mean, it seems like visuals are really imperative to the musical scene. However, it just kind of seems like fashion is not really something that the Vaporwave movement has really kind of involved itself with that deeply yet.
Yeah, that's true. But I think like my counterpoint to that would be like you say with the cyberpunk, you imagine the person with all the dreadlocks, cargo pants, etc. But I think if you think of Vaporwave, you're actually thinking of nothing, because it's sort of like a faceless movement. Like if you think of Vaporwave artist, you can only really think of someone like Saint Pepsi, who's actually shown their face publicly. Whereas,
Well, I think that's an interesting point to bring up, because I mean, anonymity was definitely something that was a part of the last conversation, and while I think the anonymity of Vaporwave is definitely interesting, and it causes definitely a very intense focus on the visual aesthetics of the album art, on the sound of the music, how far do you think a genre can really take it, but kind of keep this anonymity narrative going? Because, I think as far as like reception in popular music goes, I mean, there's always a sort of an element of cult of personality going on. And,
definitely. Yeah.
For Vaporwave, in order to sort of grow in popularity, it might be tough to sort of keep that anonymity thing.
Yeah, and you can even see that in something like PC music at the moment, which is sort of like the exact opposite of Vaporwave in that regard. But I think Vaporwave will eventually grow to include like people's faces and people's names and such, because I think you're sort of starting to see that at the moment. There's like a lot of Vaporwave artists on Twitter and Facebook and such right now.
Okay.
Whereas in the past, like everything was like strictly anonymous, really.
Well, I mean, if that ends up sort of becoming the case or becoming the norm, do you think that will be at the detriment of the genre itself or its original intention?
Yeah, I think in a sense it could be at the detriment of the genre, but it could also prove to be like a new turning point for the genre and sort of carry it on to the next level. So it's hard to say really what's going to happen.
So you were talking about, popularity earlier of the releases that you do have on the label. What are some releases that you've come out with recently that you would say have been some of the most well received, that you've had this year?
Oh well, I think the first one that comes to mind, and this would come to mind for anyone following Vaporwave at the moment, would be the 2814 album, which was a collaboration between me and another artist called Telepath.
Okay.
And that sort of started off quite well, but then it just sort of like grew in popularity over time, like quite organically, just via word of mouth. And that's sort of been getting picked up by like small parts of the music media. Like I know you mentioned it in one of your videos recently, and there's been like a few other sites that have mentioned it and stuff.
Yeah,
but
I've been giving that record. I gave that record, I think, a few listens over.
Yeah,
and I found it very ambient and relaxing, and I thought it had a great atmosphere to it, which sort of really kicked off my questions earlier about what you sort of think the genre's ties to ambient music are in general. Yeah. Because I mean, there's something very very Eno about that record, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, my own like influences can be drawn from ambient music, such as Steve Roach, for example, and Vangelis's Blade Runner soundtrack's definitely a big influence on my own music, and I think you can sort of hear it in that album. And like that album definitely can stand alone as just an ambient work, I think. But I think what makes it Vaporwave is sort of bringing in the whole conceptual side to it with the album cover, and just the overall presentation. I think that's sort of what separates Vaporwave from ambient music in general.
It's the way you sort of describe that is really interesting, because I mean, in a way it just kind of seems like what makes a record Vaporwave sometimes. I mean, not always, but sometimes has little to nothing to do with its sound.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like the genre itself, so diverse sonically. Like you was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of trap-based artists at the moment, and then you've got the ambient-based artists. But like, of course, you couldn't just put out like a Guns N' Roses album with like some Japanese text and say that's Vaporwave. Like, that wouldn't catch on. So there is some kind of sound palette, but it's quite broad, really.
Yeah, I guess for me, I'm just kind of wondering if somebody, could sort of tell me exactly where the line is drawn. I mean, I understand that, we couldn't take that 2814 cover and put it on the new Napalm Death record and then just say, this is the new Vaporwave release. Obviously that would not fly.
Yeah.
I couldn't even make that argument. But I'm sort of wondering where exactly the line is between those, between the 2814 record and the napalm death record, and when exactly was it crossed? Is just where I think I'm trying to figure things out. But it kind of sounds like, even you yourself as a vaporwave artist are trying to figure that out.
Yeah, definitely. I think the entire vaporwave scene's trying to figure that out still. Like, there is a lot of albums that really do push the boundaries, and sometimes they get accepted by the vaporwave community. Sometimes they get rejected. So it is sort of like a democratic thing, really. But I think what I'd say sort of defines the sound. Like, the best way I can define it is something that sort of brings this like dreamy aspect, or just makes you sort of like want to lay back and just like fall into a dream, basically. Which is, I suppose, where the name for Dream Catalogue came from originally. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's quite like vague, but like I think that's the best way I can describe like the broad sound.
Well, I think this dream that you're talking about. I mean, I agree that through most most vaporwave records that I've heard, I do think that there is an element of dreaminess there. That can't be ignored. But simultaneously, I wonder, it's not just any kind of general dreaminess, at least from what I have heard. I mean, it kind of feels like a dreaminess for a certain type of nostalgia for a kind of an age of technology or culture that sort of existed, but also sort of seems just completely made up.
Yeah, definitely. It's sort of like this like twisted nostalgia of the past is definitely plays a big part of defining the overall like concept of vaporwave. But I wouldn't say that defines like every vaporwave artist or every vaporwave album. But it definitely plays like a massive part in general, like on the overall sound and vision of the genre.
I mean, what would you say is, just to give an example, just first album that comes to your mind, doesn't need to be a perfect pick or anything like that. But what would you say is the least nostalgic vaporwave record?
It's a hard choice, really. Like because there's like so much vaporwave out there, and I probably heard like over 1,000 vaporwave albums in the past year alone.
Would you say Blank Banshee would be particularly nostalgic?
Yeah, I think Blank Banshee definitely has like some elements of nostalgia, because he does like sample a lot of like Windows sounds that take you sort of back to your childhood using like computers in the past.
That's true. I was just trying to throw a name out there. But one sort of interesting thing about Blank Banshee is, I mean, the way I came across Blank Banshee is for a moment in time, that record from the project that everybody knows, with sort of the the digital sort of 3D face on the front.
Oh yeah.
That was like heavily promoted on YouTube. Like almost every other video I was looking at for a while, I would see an ad for the record with the streaming song. And I was just kind of wondering, like, are there any sort of hang-ups or taboos in the vaporwave community like there are in some other communities? Like, it just kind of seems like, and I'll use this term here like I did in the previous interview. I mean, it seems like things are kind of just really open source in the vaporwave community, as far as like freedom to experiment with the genre, and that even though we do agree that nobody could come through with a grindcore record and just call it vaporwave, it doesn't seem like there's a lot in the way of like social taboos or anything like that in vaporwave, that there's nobody like really kind of trying to police the tone of anybody's music or narrative or anything like that. So that somebody can sort of actively promote their record on YouTube and nobody really, thinks of it as a negative thing.
Oh yeah, that's definitely the case. Like, if you go to the Vaporwave subreddit, for example, like the whole place is just people posting their own work, including myself. And I think that's actually a good thing, really, because it sort of like drives the whole community aspect of what Vaporwave is. But what else was you mentioning then? Sorry, like I was going to make another point. Just something at the end you was mentioning about. Oh yeah, sorry. So about the YouTube thing. Like I think that like the whole aspect of Blank Banshee getting popular on YouTube is sort of what's been driving the genre in general. You can see it on the Macintosh Plus video as well. And now our 2814 album that someone uploaded on YouTube's really like grown in popularity as well. And I think that's actually helping like that album like come to some prominence like in the wider music scene rather than just vaporwave.
So moving beyond today and just sort of what you're doing with the label this year and going sort of into the future, what do you think sort of the cultural growth potential for something like Vaporwave is right now? I mean, it kind of seems like there was a moment where Vaporwave was kind of like this musical sideshow for everybody to gawk at, but it has continued, you know, despite a lack of support from the mainstream music press, and has just kind of continued to be a really, I guess want to say a very active community of artists and listeners. And it seems like, you know, as long as that continues, there's always going to be some kind of potential for it into the future to be taken more seriously the next time it sort of rises up.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think it's sort of even rising up a little bit now. Like, for example, me and a few other guys off Dream Catalog recently did this free night Vaporwave event in Manchester in England as part of a thing called Future Everything Festival, which is like a quite a prestigious art, music and science festival in Manchester. And I don't think that would have come about if like that hadn't been like this like recent rise in the genre. And I'd say about the past year or so, since about this time last year, it's sort of been picking up a little bit of steam again. I think in general, like there's still this like perception of vaporwave being a bit of a joke genre for everyone to gawk at, like you say. But I think people's minds are starting to turn around a bit on that now. And I think like as long as like artists within the genre keep outputting like good albums constantly, like people will see there is like good talent working within it, and there is like a good concept to be explored like even further than it is currently being right now as well.
Sort of talking about the whole joke thing that you were just mentioning. I mean, it seems like there are vaporwave artists out there who don't really take themselves too seriously. Although, you know, I think sort of the jokey intentions behind their creation seem pretty plain as day. But and I think people might stumble across those artists occasionally and kind of maybe get a bit of a negative perception of the genre in general.
Yeah, definitely.
But, you know, would you say that, you know, in good vaporwave music, is there room for, you know, sort of humor, for jokiness? Generally, the kinds of artists that you invite onto your label and work with, you know, do you find yourselves or sort of take yourselves as, you know, very serious musicians? It doesn't seem like you could necessarily be making such, you know, ambient, relaxing, and sometimes very dark or eerie or unsettling music, and be so into the concept surrounding this music, but also for there to be kind of a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing to it.
Well, I think there is certainly an element of tongue-in-cheek music within vaporwave, like you say, but I think sort of what's happened is quite interesting. Like looking back to what vaporwave was about 2 or 3 years ago, like you said earlier, it could be defined by a specific sound and a specific vision and everything. But sort of what was born out of that was about 2 or 3 like separate strands of what the vision of vaporwave should be. Like I've explained my vision on here, but there's like another element of vaporwave which I'm not quite interested in myself, which is sort of like the Roman statues and all that stuff that you see on Tumblr quite often.
We're in the post-Roman statue era.
Yeah, I hope so.
Vaporwave, essentially.
Yeah, I do hope so. There's also like future funk music as well, which is sort of being born out of St. Pepsi's popularity, I think. So like there's a lot of different strands of vaporwave, and like all 3 of them sort of get conflated together under this one umbrella term, which is another reason why the genre can be so confusing to people who are new to it as well.
All right, this has been David of Dream Catalog Records, founder and owner of the label, the internet's foremost vaporwave label, also a vaporwave artist himself, talking with us about the genre and his label. Thanks for coming on, dude.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks for taking an interest in Dream Catalog as of late, and good luck with the podcast.